Hi everyone, I'm Sherman. I am a graphic designer, illustrator, and former creative lead of the airline Scoot. So today we'll be discussing through a few different topics that I've learned throughout my career, and I hope they'll be as useful for you as they've been for me. So just to give a little background of myself, I studied and majored in illustration in Temasek Polytechnic School of Design. From there, I took part in local competitions, represented Singapore in overseas events as well, and learned how to present myself as a professional for my career ahead. So I needed 2 years to finish my national service in Singapore, and right after that I started my career as a graphic designer. I took on freelance positions and different projects through word of mouth and recommendations from friends, and that's where I found my first few projects. I learned a lot along the way and I made a lot of mistakes as well. I then chose to settle down in Scoot for a full-time role as an illustrator 2 years after I started my freelance career. So eventually I got the chance to lead the design team in Scoot, and I had an active role in contributing to the future of the creative and branding. After 3.5 years, I moved on from Scoot, believing that I could learn and grow more in another role. I went on and became a brand visualizer and e-commerce designer in a different organization where I am right now. So I've handled different advertising campaigns across different media across my career, but I eventually moved into graphic design even though I started as an illustrator and learned other skills like packaging and photography as well. So I love design from all places, and I believe that my journey in design has only started and is nowhere near its end yet. So somehow it has led me to here sharing all these information and experiences with you guys. So I'm excited for that, and let's jump right in. So let's start with the creative brief. I think that is something that we've all received from time to time as creatives in creative education or when we've worked as a creative for a while. We will typically receive them in an email form, and it might not always be called a creative brief, but it should include a rough explanation of what the project is about and the details on what we would need to complete the project. Yep, so this will actually contain a few types of information, and the one thing that is very important would be the deliverables. The deliverables would be something that we can look forward to the end when we start the project. Do they want an animated illustration or a static piece? If static, would they want to use it for print or digital? And if it's digital, are we creating it for web or mobile? So all these things that we will need to consider when we are starting a project, and sometimes the clients will not always understand what they fully want at that point, but that's where our job comes in to explain these things to them and get them there and for them to understand what they actually need from us. Yeah, because we must understand that the chances of our clients being creatives are very low. The odds of that happening is very low, to be honest. So we really need to help them understand and give us the right information for us to help them get there. Remember, when we are hired as contractors or freelancers for these clients, we are there to help them solve a problem and help them to use our skill set to fulfill the brief. So I think one of the most important steps for us is to understand the project, because it is fundamental to fully grasp what we need to do. And to be honest, that is one of the hardest things for myself to grasp as a creative. It is not always about how well we can illustrate, it is not about how well we can draw or how well we can design for most of the times at this stage, but for us to truly understand what the client needs. And before providing all these solutions, we need to truly understand the problem our clients have and why they are hiring us to solve these issues. Yes, we are problem solvers hired by the clients, but hearing them and understanding the brief fully will allow us to do this more efficiently in the long run. As much as possible, we would like to make every project we touch an amazing one, but we must have the humility and professionalism to understand that we might not always understand the business as well as our clients do themselves. So this is important ultimately because it is their project and they are the ones hiring us for it. So we must remember these things. So after I feel like I've had a good understanding of the brief, I will usually ask myself these 3 questions. Number 1 would be, do I have the skill sets to complete this job in terms of the style and finishing the client requires it in? They might need it in a style that is more polished and I'm able to produce, or it might be in a style that I am not familiar with to create or not confident enough to illustrate. Number two, I would check my schedule to see if I have the capacity to take this on during this period of time. Because we might be tempted to have too many projects in a short period of time, and we might not be able to perform as well as we'd want to for each one of them. Number three, is this something that I am excited to work on? Because if the projects are going to run for a long time, this might affect your motivation or inspiration when working on this project, and it might get really draggy and you might feel that you regret taking on this project in the first place. So make sure that this is something you'd want to do and you're okay with the timeline to see it through. But there's actually one more question that I feel that that isn't talked about very often, which is the issue of the fee. So creators might not always feel comfortable bringing up the issue of fees. And so I think solving this problem, it will be healthy and helpful to bring a rate card along with you when you meet clients, so both parties have a healthy expectation of the fees when meeting and discussing about the brief and the project. But if you're working in a company or a studio or an agency, you might not always have the choice to evaluate your projects based on these questions, and you have to just take on any project that you are thrown. But these questions will still help to prioritize your projects and look at the scale and the priorities on which projects you should and should not do, or should voice out on if need be. Lastly, look through the brief to see if there's any missing information that you might need from the client. It is better to get all these information right from the start than to continuously ask for information and assets that you might need throughout the project instead, because that will break your creative flow and it might not be helpful for the client as well, as it might push back deadlines and that might incur more fees, and it wouldn't be a healthy working relationship between you and the client. So in summary, hear the client, understand the brief, ensure that you are comfortable working on the project, and number three, clarify any loose ends you need to early on with the client. So let us move on to something that we all love: illustrations. Personally, I try to learn all styles, as I love all styles, and try to learn them to at least a minimal level of mastery so that I can present these skill sets to my clients if need be and if it fulfills their brief. And I think that is what motivates me to continue learning all these different styles and to try and master them to a certain level that I would hope for. You might then ask about my personal style of illustration and the also famous looking for your own style in illustration, that famous journey that we all know and have heard of in our career. And so let me explain a little bit on that. Firstly, I don't think there is anything wrong with either ways. If you would like to have a single style, or if you like to master all different styles of illustrations for different clients. And actually, on the flip side, I believe and I think it is really commendable that illustrators and artists who take years of their time and effort to hone their skills and to improve on one style of illustration that resonates with them personally, and to truly master that skill set. But as to most things, there are pros and cons to both approaches. For illustrators who are looking to touch on different styles and master different illustration executions, they might be able to cater to a more wider spectrum of clients and brands if need be. But on the other hand, we usually wouldn't have the chance to truly perfect a certain style that as much as we would want to, because of the lack of time and energy. But for illustrators with very unique and distinguished styles, it is always almost much easier to recognize their styles and when we see them, and that will definitely help to have that impression in the client's minds. And the clients will always go back to them when they need that certain style. So there will always be these pros and cons between these two approaches, but there is no one right way that anyone can say is the best. Being an illustrator is one of the rare jobs where we can choose to try out different styles or stay on a single path that we are faithful to. So don't be pressured to go into a certain way just because someone else says so. But as mentioned earlier in the talk, I'm an illustrator who touches on various different styles, and I will always propose the style that I feel that is best for the brand. This has allowed me to have a wider spectrum of work, and I'll be showing two of those projects today for us to actually go through and look through. Okay, so for this portion of the talk, I will be going through some of the projects that I've done. I'll be talking more about the thought processes, why I designed them this way, and maybe some things to look out for if you guys might be interested to do something similar. So let's start with a set of illustrations for a stamp design project that I did with SingPost. This is a particularly memorable project as it allowed me to do something very special in a space that was always seemed like it was a traditional media and had no space for digital media. The brief was to use this set of stamp designs to renew interest in local tea time snacks in Singapore, where young people or young adults might not be as interested in them as they might seem like a thing of the past. So the challenge here was to present these snacks in a way that was fun and exciting, but also allowing them to stay true to their origins. To show that these important traditions in Singapore can actually come back as something that is exciting and fun and relatable to Singaporeans of all ages. From there, I thought about how I could use my skill set, specifically illustrations, to solve this brief. And here are the results. So my solution for this was to redesign these snacks into cute little characters that would hopefully be endearing and cute enough for even young children to be interested in them. So the designs were based off 4 different local tea time snacks that we have in Singapore that have been here throughout generations. They are lapis sagu, kueh dadar, the char siu pao, and a kueh tutu. I came up with 8 to 10 different designs for this project, and eventually 4 were chosen to be the final design of the stamps. For this project, I didn't choose to go with very overcomplicated designs or designs with a lot of details, to keep illustrations simple with not too many details because of various reasons. Number 1, considering that the size of the stamps are no larger than 5 cm usually, it would be unwise to actually put in too much details into a media of that size. To have such a complicated design within such a small space would actually not be helpful, as we wouldn't be able to see all these details unless we look at them really up close. And so these principles actually apply to designs like mobile icons or UI designs as well. Another reason is that also eventually when they are printing the stamps and the final design, they might run into issues with printing and having all these details come out in the stamps, which even though I believe SingPost has the ability to produce stamps and designs of such a high level, but I wanted to reduce the risk of these things happening, and therefore I chose to go with a simpler design without having to deal with such issues. Having the illustrations done in this style also allowed me to create a little depth in the background to allow the characters to pop a little more in the stamps, and it will seem as though there is actually a spotlight cast on them and they are the star of the show here. This helps to lead our eyes to the center of the design itself on what is important, using the negative space around it. Instead of having just the characters smile blankly, I try to give them a humorous expression and add a little pinch of wackiness in there, which I personally love. Now we will move on to the illustrations that I've done in Scoot instead. I started out in Scoot as an illustrator, and therefore these are really close to my heart. I was given the freedom and autonomy to inject humor whenever I wanted to make the illustrations as crazy as I wanted to go crazy on the food, the animals, and the destinations that we flew to, and to draw all these planes and clouds, and also many clouds. Being the only airline using illustrations so strongly and evidently in their branding and marketing materials, this really allowed Scoot to stand out in a very saturated market of having air stewardess and destination photos just being at the forefront of their marketing and branding creatives. So these illustrations had to capture the essence of the locations that the airline flies to, and to represent the culture as much as we could, and to potentially have potential passengers be excited about their next dream holiday. For the style of illustration, we chose to go with a chibi style when I was illustrating for the company. As the popularity of Japanese anime and manga were growing in the last decade, this actually fit well with Scoot's plan to target the main target audience of the young adults in Singapore. With these illustrations, the direction was to keep them simple. No shadows, no lighting, just a character with a simple message or activity. This also allowed me to produce the illustrations in a much faster pace in Photoshop. A quick sketch was usually sufficient for the approval stages when we had to discuss them with the marketing team, but that was sufficient for the approvals and I would actually move on to ink them immediately in Photoshop after. As these illustrations were usually placed on web banners, on magazines and media of various sizes, we needed to keep the illustrations small and compact to allow them to be placed in all these different media and not be awkwardly have to be cropped in certain ways that would not fit well. Another style of illustration that I do in Scoot as well is a full colored design with lots of details, which is in contrast to the designs that I just showed you, which was simple and for marketing purposes only. So this was for the in-flight menu called the Scoot Cafe, and let's talk about the thought process for this. So the requirement was for the illustration style to be consistent with Scoot's branding, but actually for this time to be bringing the audience to the food on board instead. This was increasingly difficult because an illustrated food is usually not as helpful to attract a hungry stomach to ordering food as compared to a photograph. For photographs, you usually get a very accurate description and idea of what you'd like to order and what you'll be getting in the end. But for illustrations, unless you're doing a hyper-realistic illustration, you're not going to have that effect. Furthermore, the style that we have is worlds apart from the hyper-realistic style that we were going to do. So what was the solution going to be? I decided that we can use the line art that we've been using for our branding, but to include color and humor to enhance the style instead, to push the effect as much as possible. Playing with the light and shadows and colors, I chose to present the food we were serving in a way that would allow for some imagination and fun instead. This approach might not always be about having an actual photo to promote the food instead, but this solves the issue of allowing us to keep the branding and illustrations consistent with the rest of the brand. From here, let me go into a little on about the execution that I do and how I get there. Let me touch on a little about the tools that I'll be using and how I get inspired and how I improve. Because these are things that I've always been interested to find out when I look at other illustrators and artists, and I hope that is the same for you guys. So for myself, actually my tools are nothing special. I work mainly on Photoshop. Unless I want to get things vectorized, I will do that in Illustrator instead. So I do most of the illustrations in Photoshop, from sketch to inking to coloring to the finishing. But you don't have to be confined to Photoshop itself, as there are so many other programs out there and softwares that have comprehensive tools, and yeah, they are equally as good as Photoshop, and you can use them to illustrate as well. So if you do not have access to Photoshop, don't worry, because there are so many free softwares out there nowadays and you can use them and create amazing works as well. There are so many different brushes and settings that we can use in all these different programs now to complete these illustrations, and sometimes just tweaking just one or two different settings will help to create a whole new feel and look to the illustrations that you are doing. So I really recommend for anyone who is interested to dive into this world of illustrations if you want to, and not be afraid of or be restricted by these tools. For the drawing tablet I connect to my computer, I use a Wacom Intuos Pro. The response time, quality and build of the drawing tablet has definitely been sufficient for me to create work to a professional standard. But if you don't have experience in illustrations yet or don't have access to these tools, you can always start the traditional way by just using pencil and paper. So pencil and paper are more than sufficient for a start, and they are a lot more economical. They are readily accessible and are usually materials that most of us can get our hands on. Having equipment like a Wacom tablet and Photoshop might help, and it might make things easier, but actually paper and pencil needs to be second nature to you before using these tools. These tools will not help you get good immediately, but we still need good old practice and hard work. And that is what will actually really help you get to the point where you want to. There are no shortcuts to getting better illustrations, just plain old hard work. But I promise you, this end result is worth it. Another thing I hear from students or peers is that they struggle with the fact that they might not be as talented or gifted as compared to other students or their peers. It might appear to them that some of them, a selected few, might be better at creating these amazing works, and they might feel discouraged, disheartened, and feel like giving up after feeling inferior to their peers instead. To be honest, I felt that way as well. I think most of us have, when we see our peers create works that are so much better than ours and are amazing in our opinion. But that shouldn't discourage and dishearten you. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. There will always be illustrators out there who are younger, more capable, and doing more amazing works than you can ever dream of. Yes, I do believe that there are individuals who are more gifted and more talented in this field than us, but the fact is, we might never catch up and we might never reach their level, but it shouldn't stop us from trying to improve and pursuing this passion of ours and trying to achieve what we want to. I really encourage you to not give up and continue improving and to practice. You will never know how good you'll be if you don't continue trying. And so take up courses, find resources from industry professionals, and just keep at it, putting in the time, putting in the effort, and who knows, you might actually get somewhere. But if you don't try, you will never know. The amount of tutorials and free resources on the internet are so much more accessible nowadays as compared to in the past. So if you really want to, keep at it, look for these tutorials, and just do the work. It doesn't matter how well others are doing, but how much you're improving, and keep your focus on that. So finding inspiration in our time has never been easier for me. There are so many resources now online. There's Facebook, there's Instagram, there's Pinterest, and all these resources always contain good and fantastic inspirations that we can always tap on. I regularly follow any illustrators or artists that I see that I admire, or any work of theirs that I see. And that allows me to have a continuous feed of amazing works that they produce on a weekly basis on my feeds on all these social media platforms. And that has always helped to have more inspiration for me on a day-to-day basis, even when I have a mental block or when I'm just trying to take a break from work. Looking at these great works always motivate me to improve more, to practice, to put in the work. And so we'll be talking about a little more on what we haven't touched on much today, which is practice. We all know that practicing is difficult and it is something that we all don't like to do. And it takes an inhumane amount of time and motivation to persevere even through the hard times. Some specifics I recommend to practice on would be: number one, the human anatomy. The human anatomy is one of the most difficult things for illustrators and artists to handle and to get right. And it is something that I practice on a regular basis but fail at more often than not. This is something fundamental that illustrators will need to get a handle on because, like it or not, most illustration jobs will include this. Having humans in illustrations really helped convey the message a lot better, and not using words that much, but using the action, the activity they're doing to push the message through using visual means. These don't always have to be large front page scenes, but even smaller illustrations that complements the story on the magazine and helps extend the story to a more visual space. Practicing human anatomy will definitely be tedious and take a long time, but I promise you, it will be something worth doing and it will bring you to a whole new level. So different artists will actually draw humans in different styles. You might see different artists drawing faces, different bodies in different styles, but these styles are usually grounded in the anatomy knowledge that they already have and developed in the past. So these styles usually only come after they have already the base knowledge that they require. So the second point I would suggest for you guys to practice on would be learning how the body moves as well. Another thing that will sort of be an extension of the human anatomy would be learning how the body moves and poses in different situations. In my time working with different illustrators and artists, the issue that keeps coming up is that the characters are not posed and moving in a convincing way. This is usually due to the fact that the illustrators do not have the base knowledge of human anatomy that they need, or are also not using photo references to complete this project. Even a standing pose drawn well can be epic instead of just being boring and static. The shifting and placement of weight can usually be seen in the hips or the shoulders of the characters where we are drawing. We might be tempted to skip the trouble and jump straight into the illustration itself, but I assure you the research, the practice, and the photo references will really help to create a more convincing character that you're drawing and fulfill a better illustration at the end. This really allows us to avoid the issue of drawing characters and being stiff like robots, but to create fluid and convincing characters that will fulfill the brief much better. It might seem like something trivial, but these details are really what differentiates between the good and the best. Okay, so for the third point, I will be talking about perspectives. The perspectives is important as it helps to create a more convincing image as well, where you use angles, vanishing points, and the depths to create a scene where the buildings and the characters look in place. These tools will actually help you more than you know, and they are awesome tools that will make an illustration much better. So on the fourth point, lighting. So lighting is something that most of us will struggle with, and learning about like how light bounces off different textures, different angles, and different forms. Lighting will be something that will be difficult for all of us to grasp. But learning this will allow for so much more possibilities in your work, and it will be the difference between a horror scene and a romantic scene, and it creates forms and shapes with just the information it provides without even the need to draw the form itself. So learn to play with dynamic lighting and use that to your advantage when researching for your illustration or your project. So on the last point, what is important would also be to learn how to draw form on a 2D space. Learning how to see and draw a 3D object in a 2D space is not easy, and is something that most illustrators find hard to grasp, but it will really help to push the realism and the shape of your object, and it will help it to not look flat in the final product. So using all these different things, the lighting, the angles, the form, this will really help to make your illustration more lively, more convincing, and it will really push the messages a lot more than what you would get if you ignore all these little details. So these 5 things are some very fundamental things that I still practice on a weekly basis to this day. Practicing these fundamentals are very boring sometimes, but it will really help you to get to where you need to be in future. So to end off, I'd like to just say a few things. As designers and illustrators, we need to be open to opportunities, new technologies, and being out there in the world. Don't keep yourselves at home and neglect everything else in your life. Sure, illustrating in our jobs might be something really important in our lives, but I can confidently say that it has rarely been the most important thing in my life. Even though I love to continue this conversation, we'll need to end off here. Feel free to link up with me over Instagram or LinkedIn and to have a chat. We'll definitely drop a reply when I can, and thanks and take care everyone.
Hey, I got a confession.